yesterday, Trump and his team released this executive order that is ordering. It's not actually demanding any specific action. It's not creating legislation itself. It's asking politicians, it's asking legislators to develop policies to make in vitro fertilization, which is a fertility treatment, more affordable for families. And this was something Trump talked about on the campaign trail. It's something that I think a lot of people are aware of, in part because we have a very low birth rate in this country. We have lots of questions about fertility, but also because some of the ethical issues that come up with IVF also come up when you talk about abortion. And a lot of you will remember that I think about a year ago at this point, Alabama's had the Supreme Court ruled that embryos that are created through IVF need to be treated with the same rights as children. And this was during a wrongful death suit brought by parents whose embryos were being stored in the hospital, and somebody who was not authorized to be there got in, picked up these frozen embryos, dropped them, and it again creates a modern age ethical gray area. So what did you guys think of this? I know there's been a huge reaction on X to this conversation.
Yeah, this one's actually pretty near and dear to me. I'm an IVF baby. I'm also an organismal biologist and a physiologist. And so I've done a lot in the IVF space and just in the like OB-GYN space too. But I think the bottom line is we have a declining birth rate. Other cultures around the world have a heightened birth rate. And we have just so much working against us right now. Testosterone has dropped substantially since the 80s. Sperm count has decreased by 50% in 70 years. All the women that I know are on the pill or have been on the pill. Everyone's covered in microplastics. Our brains are wrapped in it. Everything is working against us because everything is affecting fertility. And the bottom line is the health aspect. It is the chemical soup that we're living in, and that is the root cause that we need to address. But in order to actually be able to have time and to live long enough to be able to address that root cause, we're going to need some intervention. And I think that intervention is IVF. And I understand the backlash of it's intervening with perhaps God's plan, or maybe there's religious ethical reasons why people are questioning it, and that's absolutely valid. But I think even if we are approaching it from the stance of creationism, well, God gave us brains. We are smart enough to develop these technologies to expand what we could do and to expand ourselves in our own way. It's natural to have heart attacks, but we have stents, we have pacemakers, and we are able to intervene and make that. So intervention necessarily, I don't know that it has to be an ethical issue. And we can still implement situations where, we can look after embryos better. We can do those things, but I don't think that necessarily means no IVF at all.
What do you think, Emily?
Well, I really couldn't disagree with Joy more. And I'll just start by saying that every human life has value, including Joy's. My son was born out of wedlock. The children who are conceived in rape, the children who are conceived in IVF, they all have value, and all life needs to be protected, to include the vast majority of the children that are aborted through the IVF process. The IVF process is barbaric. It is macabre. It takes away all the sanctity of life and distills it down to a scientific experiment where eugenics is highly common. Abortion is more often than not occurring. And then you have the issue of the entire industry where you're actually selling these children, these human souls that are then being experimented on, frozen indefinitely, or just cast off and trashed. So I think that the industry is very unethical. I think that Christians, and as a Catholic, I find the whole process from start to finish to be abhorrent. You start the process off with something unethical. It's something that goes against our faith, and it ends most commonly in abortion, which is also against our faith. So, and every step in between involves unethical action. So I, as a Catholic and as an American Christian, the President Trump's promise that he was going to have insurance companies pay for IVF is the reason I did not vote for him. That was my very last straw for Trump. He had plenty of red flags before that, but it really woke me up when I realized that he was actually planning on going through with that promise. And I think that a lot of Christians are regretting their vote after this executive order. And I'm just glad I wasn't a part of voting him into office, because then I would have that on my conscience as well.
Emily, can I ask you, the Catholic Church, from my understanding, doesn't believe in any kind, there's never supposed to be a third party involved in conception. Is there any kind of fertilization treatment that you are okay with,
Yeah.
or is it kind of off the table entirely?
So there are different methods. NAPRO technology is an ethical option, and I'm sure Joy knows about that if she's involved in this space. So NAPRO technology is involving like removing physical impediments to conception, and it's kind of what she was talking about, where if you need an appendectomy, it's not immoral or unethical to have medical treatments, but it is immoral and unethical to be getting involved in the macabre practice of inserting yourself in the creation of a human soul. And so if there is a physical malady that can be adjusted with surgery, or if there is a hormonal imbalance that can be managed through pharmaceuticals that are not unethically derived, because we know a lot of pharmaceuticals are actually the result of abortions. So you have to look into that as well. But the process from start to finish of IVF is immoral, unethical, and is explicitly against the faith of 1 billion Catholics in this world, and our church has said it just that plainly, that it is not something permissible for a Catholic. So there are things that infertile couples can do, but as Christians, we believe, and there are plenty of examples in the Bible of what barren couples should do if they are dealing with infertility, and you should go to God with those prayers, and you should trust in His providence and His will.
I always find abortion or IVF an interesting topic, because it seems to have become a modern crutch for the abortion argument. I think that people, especially when I go back to this case in Alabama, the question became, oh, well, if they don't let us have abortions, would they cancel IVF? And to me, IVF and abortions, while there are similar ethical issues, operate in very different spaces. And it doesn't feel like people who are pro-abortion really care about infertility the same way. There are a lot of Christian institutions that have medical, I'm thinking of like Loma Linda University. They have a whole page on IVF and how it can be done ethically. For so many people, the question of you have to mass harvest eggs and you mass fertilize them, and then you put them on ice while you're waiting to use them. You might implant multiple at a time to better your odds. My question, and this might be a good one for Joy, given her background, do we have to do it that way? I mean, obviously, this would not be Emily's solution if you're taking a hard stance against IVF, but hypothetically, could we bring IVF into the modern era and into a more selective process, let's say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree that we should. I do think that there needs to be massive reform in the whole industry of IVF, because there is a lot of shady things happening. And I also want to be respectful of religions who disagree with it. Of course, I'm not going to argue that. But there can absolutely be less embryo harvesting. You can only choose to harvest 4, and you can have all 4 or implant all 4. So that's definitely something we can do. We have a lot of embryo waste. And I do think that's a problem, because one, you can make the argument that those are human souls being trapped in a freezer, or just that that's also a very expensive endeavor from a business side as well. So in all accounts, the overharvesting is not a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that we hear about, like, I know Amy Schumer, the comedian, has talked publicly about, like, she's like, oh, we harvested this many, and, actually we only get down to this many, so you have to do it this way. But sometimes that seems like the anti-science argument. Like, if science is so good,
it's only 7% of the children end up being born. So
Mhm.
where do the other ones go? I mean, pro-lifers say that life begins at conception. What happened to that stance? And I think what you said, Hannah, earlier is true, that it's mostly just a fact of like people don't really know this process, but more and more people are talking about it, not just because of Trump's stance on it, but because of what Joy said earlier, that we have a real problem with the fertility health of Americans right now. And instead of going to big pharma to solve our problems, we need to get down to root causes. And I don't agree with what Joy said about we have to buy ourselves time by enriching big pharma even further in their corruption.
No, and I completely agree. There needs to be some serious reform. We are not doing it as ethically as we should be. But I do very much believe that the West is a culture that is dying. And in order to compete with other cultures, we need more people, and we need more people fast, because we are a dying culture if we are not even approaching replacement levels. And the chemical soup that we've been living in is nothing that humans have ever seen in the history of ever. So we don't know how to deal with this. So in order to figure that out, we might need a little bit of help along the way.
From
So
big
you're saying
pharma?
basically battle on all fronts,
Yes.
like have IVF, but also continue to correct health issues in the population.
We're going to the
Because
people
big
that
pharma
made the
is not.
problem to solve it. We're going to the people who made the problem to solve it. Big
Oh,
pharma is part of
absolutely.
the problem here, and we're asking them now to help us. I think not. I think that pumping
Absolutely.
women full of hormones and devaluing the life this way, I think it goes against what pro-lifers say about their own beliefs, which is that life begins at conception. You either believe that or you don't.
Right.
And even
It does. And I can't argue that one. I don't want to be disrespectful to an entire religion. I completely understand that. But big pharma, as terrible it is, I'm completely part of the MAHA movement. I completely understand. Big pharma is mostly bad, but it doesn't mean everything to do with pharma and medicine is bad and can't be useful. We can use pieces of everything to help us as a society. I think this is one of those areas where they can be used for overall good, even if them as a whole is not good.
Do you think it would be different if couples who went through IVF, and this is to both of you, were obligated, as part of your agreement with your IVF clinic, you have to try and implant every embryo that you create? Do you think that would shift the industry at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people would also be very receptive to it too, especially if they decide to choose less. And I think that would incentivize them to also harvest less. So I think that would be an good.
I think we would need to address the eugenics issue and the selection, the way that the process is done. The standard process is that they pick and choose which embryos to be discarded based on whether or not they are the best or the most ideal quality. And so like, unless a couple is willing to implant a child that they created in a test tube, unless they are willing to implant one that the doctors or the eugenicists, as I call them, are telling them is likely to have a birth defect, for example, because that's what they're screening for. And they can screen for many more things than ever before now. And so I don't think you said that you don't think there's going to be a pushback, but I think when it comes down to the practical elements of this, when you say, hey, we have 3 ideal children and one that's deformed, what do you want to do with the one that's likely to have spina bifida? They're going to abort it every time. I promise you that. It's a form of eugenics. If they say, hey, it's this child has Down syndrome, but the other 2 don't, are you willing to implant all 3 and possibly end up with triplets, but one of them's has Down syndrome?
But I would think you would have to, sorry to cut in. I think you would have to have this agreement before you create the embryos. Like if you are like, hello, doctor at the IVF clinic, I want to enter, the IVF clinic's policy could be hypothetically like you are obligated to give every single embryo a chance at life. Like so much of the way we do modern medicine, and this is outside of fertility treatments, is well, this is the way it always has been. So that's how we do it. But hypothetically, and I understand your concern completely, because there is a ranking process when they create the embryos. They rank them for basically who is the most likely to survive and who's the least likely to have adverse health effects. Because obviously, even children who are conceived naturally can be miscarried. Even without intervention, it's not a guarantee that every pregnancy sticks, unfortunately. Hypothetically, if you were obligated before you created embryos to implant all of them, maybe they would give you the genetic ranking. Maybe it wouldn't be necessary at that point. But I would think in some ways that's almost a parental screening process. It seems like some of the issue, and again, there's not a perfect answer for IVF because it is complicated. And again, we don't have a cultural agreement about life. We don't have a cultural agreement about when it starts, and it seems like it's divisive. But on the other hand, I can see the argument for our population is in decline and we need to do something. And is it better to do multiple things at once, like continue to find ways to help couples to have children? Obviously, IVF is a complicated subject because you can then open the door to conversations about surrogacy or embryo adoptions, which are very different than just a, man and woman who are married, who are having trouble conceiving a child on their own. Do you think that this conversation about making in vitro fertilization affordable is ultimately going to get the White House in trouble because it opens the door to these other cultural issues?
I think it definitely opens the door to a lot of things. And when you were talking about the hypothetical, the thought experiment, like if we could somehow completely remove abortion from the process, I think you would get a lot more Christians on board. You wouldn't get Catholics on board because it's not just the abortion issue that is why we are opposed to IVF. It's also the masturbation involved at the beginning of the process. Like you said, even if we removed eugenics and abortion, you wouldn't get everybody on board because Christians that believe that God is the author of life and it doesn't belong in a test tube are not going to get on board regardless. But I do agree that it opens the door to a lot of other problems. IVF is a highly unregulated industry in America. And even if Trump is going to work with health insurance companies to get IVF to be free for American women, we are going to be running into a lot of second and third order effects that are deleterious to our society. I do not think that birth rate issues should be addressed at all costs. I think you can't gain the whole world and lose your soul in the process, right? So I think we should address root issues of infertility, and we need to do it even if that takes more time, and we're having birth rate issues. We can encourage women to come home, have healthy lifestyles, de-stress, get out of the girl boss corporate world, because that is the reason. It's a top reason for infertility. And I think that those would have a much better and less chance of negative second and third order effects for the MAHA movement to care about and for the Trump administration to focus on.
And I think those are great solutions too. I'm completely on board with all of those. I do also think that we need the extra help, just because if we lose the birth rate, we lose the culture. It is gone. And we are competing with some serious cultures that are serious threats to us. And also, I think that bringing this to light right now, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Just opening these conversations is going to be able to help us make these processes more ethical, fine tune all of the issues, and just make the entire process of surrogacy, of embryo adoption, of all of it, more practical and more of a reflection of what the people would want.
I totally agree. And I think that millennial women are the ones that have been talking about this almost exclusively for millennial and I guess Gen X that started the process. But I'm very happy that we are now talking it more broadly as a society, because it seems that it's been mostly women in their 30s and 40s that have been kind of bearing the burden of this ethical dilemma, and it's kind of behind closed doors and in this sterilized environment, not very different from the way Planned Parenthood has always dealt with abortion. It's sterilizing the process, and really sunlight is the best disinfectant, Joy. And I'm really liking how Kristen Hawkins and Lila Rose and and good pro-life voices are coming out and talking about this, and they really never did before. So we have Trump to thank for that.
That's true. And those both of those perspectives need to be out there, and they need to be talking. I completely agree with that, because whatever the solution is going to be is honestly probably going to be a mixture of both. It's going to be somewhere in between. That's usually how that works. And I think that's the best solution for everybody, something that's more reflective of what people as a whole would want.